The Lord of Darkness by Shelby Cody Sweeney. Part 2, The Beginning of the World. Chapter 1, The Forbidden Fruit. Adam and Eve were not the first humans per se, but they lived during humanity's soul age when your species had evolved enough for us to converse with you, and they were the first ones we contacted. Uriel selected them, or more accurately, Uriel selected Eve, and Raphael insisted we involve both sexes, so we included Eve's future mate Adam. As I've alluded to previously, Uriel can usually visualize the most probable outcomes considering an extraordinary number of variables. He chose Eve because he concluded that she was the most likely to be open-minded about visitors from another plane of existence. He was certainly right about that. On most of our worlds, we create what we call a garden, a haven with plenty of food and water to give you the opportunity to survive into collective maturity. Eden was actually the name of the village where Adam and Eve met. We left the garden nameless, but you eventually named it the Fertile Crescent. We nestled the garden between the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf, irrigated it with the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates rivers, and filled it with especially fertile soil. As planned, that was the area where humans transitioned from hunter-gatherers to agricultural societies. Adam and Eve were both born in the year 9523 BC. Adam was born into the agricultural village of Eden in Mesopotamia, and Eve was born into a hunter-gatherer tribe elsewhere in the region. One sunny day in the spring of 9500 BC, Nick decided to visit Earth. His t-shirt displayed a graphic of an apple tree with two humans standing under it, and his stated reason for going was to see the trees and because he was curious about the humans. There have been many arguments about whether or not this is true. Personally, I believe him. I'm partially to blame for his curiosity, having recently bragged about how quickly the humans were acclimating to the new concepts I exposed them to. At this point in human history, you were justifiably wary of new creatures, but you understood so little that a being from the celestial plane was as alien as a being from the next forest over. Due to my awesomeness, I gained Eve's trust in just a few meetings. Later, I began to suspect she could recognize my presence before I emerged into her visible spectrum. I'd never mentioned it to anyone because I thought I was being paranoid. Now I never mention it out of shame over what happened next. Nick says that when he first saw Eve, it was like lightning. It was like every electron in his body picked up speed and his brain started firing too many neurons at once. For a moment he was dazed, like he'd been blinded by light, because his conscious mind couldn't process what just happened. But when he looked back on it, he remembered it perfectly, because his brain had been using that processing power to store a perfect memory, because somehow he knew deep down that that moment was crucial. Eve's hair was matted, and her clothes unflattering. She was coated in dirt and grime, and her arms were scratched up from thorny bushes. But for some reason, Nick was incapable of taking his eyes off her as she gathered berries, a thoroughly mundane task. And then something extraordinary happened. Eve stopped and looked in his direction, the way a dog might look at a newly discovered squirrel. Gabriel? Nick was so shocked he'd been noticed that he reflexively made himself visible, audible, and tangible. Others claim he did it on purpose. I'm genuinely not sure. Nick, he corrected her. Nick, Eve repeated slowly, committing it to memory. You must be the hunter. Nick took a moment to process the statement. He wasn't used to viewing things through the lens of a primitive nomadic species. How do you know Gabriel's not the hunter? Eve laughed. It was short but unrestrained. She doesn't have hunter's eyes. Nick fought a chill. I do? Eve nodded with an amused smile. And Nick left, unnerved by the experience. Nick couldn't stop thinking about his brief conversation with her. He told himself he'd visit her one more time to prove he was getting worked up over nothing. The weather was mild when he arrived, but the previous few days had been rainy. Eve was in no mood for conversation. It had been 3 days and 2 nights since she had fire, and the sun would set in just a few hours. Actually, Eve would have thought of it as the sun setting in just a few hands, since at the time she used the width of her hands to measure the sun's passage across the sky. She'd spent the day scrounging up dryish plant matter and drying it in the sun for use as kindling and firewood. Now she was rubbing a stick against a larger stick to try generating enough heat to catch fire. It wasn't going well. Evening, said Nick brightly, appearing in a burst of light. That day, his t-shirt pictured a herd of deer in the style of human cave paintings. Eve didn't look up from her work. Not now. Nick was surprised how much her dismissal stung, but he quickly recovered his casual demeanor. He leaned disinterestedly against a nearby tree while continuing to stare openly at her. My bad for coming unannounced. I'll try not to interrupt. Nick didn't move or speak for the next 5 minutes, at which point he started to fidget. Then he began to pace. Then he paced so far he walked past Eve, in a circle around a nearby rock outcrop, then past her again. Do you mind? She snapped irritably. It's just... Never mind, I shouldn't. What? Eve demanded, still angry but growing curious too. Nick covered his mouth to shield his grin and shook his head firmly. Curiosity winning out over frustration, Eve set down the sticks and gave him her full attention. Seconds ticked by slowly. Either tell me or don't. I can't help it, Nick decided. There's Flint right there. I can't let this continue. Nick could have easily lit the fire for her using celestial powers. It was also against the rules, but nobody would have minded. Actually, it's unlikely anyone would have minded this moment either, if it hadn't opened the floodgates of knowledge sharing. Nick picked up a piece of flint and another stone and sat beside Eve. He struck the stones together, and a spark flew off into the kindling, igniting it. Eve ensured some of the bigger branches caught fire before letting out a triumphant cheer. How did you do that? Eve asked, eyes sparkling with wonder. Nick opened his mouth and was shocked when his brain failed to supply a clever response. Normally he'd say something cocky and annoyingly evasive, yet somehow charming and intriguingly mysterious. After all, he had a well-earned reputation as a player, with very little trouble convincing women to date him, and quite a bit of trouble sticking around after any mention of relationship or commitment. Eve made Nick feel vulnerable in a way he didn't want to run away from. He was too scared to admit how badly he wanted to impress her, not to get something out of her, but because he genuinely cared what she thought of him. So, Nick sat with her beside the fire and explained. He explained how the flint worked, why it worked, and how to identify the rocks it would work with. He explained far more than was necessary because he liked the way Eve was looking at him and didn't want her to stop. As an afterthought, Nick added, Oh, and it'd be great if you don't mention me or any of this to Gabriel. Why? Asked Eve. I could get in trouble, Nick said. Eve looked perplexed. For helping me with the fire? No, well, yeah, but mostly for talking to you at all, Nick explained. Eve scooted closer to him so their knees were touching, and her face was a few inches from his. She gazed deeply into his eyes and whispered, Why are you talking to me at all? Nick was suddenly acutely aware of every second as it passed. I gotta get going now. Oh, Eve replied disappointedly. Goodbye, Nick. Goodbye, Eve, he said, and vanished from perceptibility before adding, For the last time? It wasn't the last time. Nick told himself the next time would be the last time. Well into that third visit, they were sitting on a boulder, gazing up at the stars. Nick had a picture of the Andromeda Galaxy on his shirt. He temporarily displaced Eve's fire for the occasion, promising to return it unharmed. The Milky Way burst across the sky in all its splendor. Eve laughed and nudged him playfully. You're making that up. I'm not, Nick insisted. They're the same as the big bright sun you see in the day. They're too small, she argued. No, they're just far away. For example, Nick floated upwards until Eve looked small, then floated back down to her. See, I didn't shrink, I was just far away. Eve frowned. The sun's so big, other stars must be unbelievably far away. Oh, farther away than you can conceive of, Nick confirmed. Farther than you can conceive of, she repeated with awe. I can conceive of it, I've seen it, he replied. But you assume I can't? That's very condescending, she pointed out. Nick began to argue, but then he realized, You're right. I'm sorry. After a brief silence, Eve asked, Why do you visit me? I said I'm sorry. No, really, she insisted. Gabriel visits to teach me religion. I can't tell what your goals are. Nick stammered, I just like it here. With you. They both blushed and looked away. I like you here too, Eve admitted shyly. Nick wanted to kiss her, but couldn't bring himself to do it, no matter how loudly his inner voice berated him. Without meaning to, he stayed with her for 3 more days. After that, Nick's visits only became longer and more frequent. He kept a close eye on my schedule to ensure we never crossed paths. In all the times I spoke with Eve, she never let slip any knowledge she'd gotten from Nick. Between Nick's 5th and 6th visits, Eve asked me about my hair. We got to talking, and I ended up willing the tangles out of her hair for her. When Nick appeared to Eve a 6th time, he was stunned by her appearance. "You look beautiful." Eve smiled and blushed. "You're handsome as ever." Nick closed the distance separating them and very nearly kissed her. But he stopped himself because he was a powerful immortal being capable of transforming her life with a flick of his wrist, and she was just a lonely 23-year-old human girl. He couldn't put her in a position where she felt like she needed to return his affection. But if she wanted to kiss him, then he certainly wasn't going to deprive her of the opportunity. Eve waited for him to kiss her, heart thundering in her chest. She was just a tribeless young woman, and he was an ancient, powerful angel. Why would he want to kiss her? But she was fairly certain he was going to kiss her, and she very much hoped he would. Nick and Eve stood there for a long moment, staring into each other's eyes. Finally, Eve turned away, and the tension snapped like a bungee cord. Nick cleared his throat. "You, do any good hunting lately?" "I caught a rabbit last week," Eve told him. "That's great," Nick replied. They continued to chat about trivial things instead of speaking their hearts. On Nick's 10th visit, there was a thunderstorm. With Eve's limited access to shelter, thunderstorms were no joke. Her mother was killed by one years earlier. Eve was instantly alert when the first roll of thunder rumbled across the sky, while Nick smiled appreciatively at the symphony. We seraphim can hear better than you humans. We can hear all the nuances of the air currents as they swirl and collide. We can hear the raindrops whizzing through the air before they land. We can hear the whispers of electricity building up into a crescendo of thunder. Not surprisingly, we occasionally visit worlds solely to appreciate the orchestral splendor of a storm. In fact, it was Nick's excuse for visiting Earth on this particular occasion, and Michael didn't give it a second thought. "We need shelter," Eve told Nick, jostling his shoulder. "We're fine," he assured her. "Not fine," she insisted. Nick smirked, grabbed her hand, and teleported them to a nearby cave. Eve screamed. She would have fallen over backwards if he hadn't caught her. Nick chuckled. "Sorry, I should have warned you." "Yes, you should have!" Eve exclaimed, pushing him. "But you gotta admit..." "Yes," Eve admitted, "it's a good shelter." A flash of lightning sent her scurrying further into the cave, which was just deep enough to shield them from the elements. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Nick assured her. "Because I'm a prophet?" Eve guessed. Nick laughed. "No, because He swallowed the truth and said, "Yes, because you're a prophet." Eve smiled knowingly. Then she sat with her back against the cave wall and patted the ground beside her invitingly. Nick joined her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. He told her tales of long-ago worlds until she drifted off, nuzzling him in her sleep. Nick kissed her head gently, wishing he could make this moment last for years. On the way to his 11th visit, Nick was running out of excuses and scribbled nature as his reason for visiting Earth. To add emphasis, his shirt spelled out nature with various natural things like sticks and rocks. Michael stopped him at the portal. "What's up?" asked Nick. "My question exactly," replied Archangel Michael of Security. "Be honest with me. What are you really up to?" "Camping?" Nick lied weakly. Michael sighed. "I knew it. You're stalking that human girl, aren't you?" "I wouldn't say I'm stalking her," Nick replied defensively. "Last time you were there for over a month," Michael pointed out. "You don't think spying on someone for 5.5 weeks constitutes stalking?" And that's when Nick realized he hadn't been caught. "You got a point. Any chance you let me through anyway and also not tell the others?" Michael looked at his friend's hopeful face and reluctantly smiled. He missed Nick during the latter's increasingly frequent absences and was more than a little annoyed by the deceit, but he assumed it was just a phase Nick had to get out of his system. Nick had grown a little gloomy and restless on Uxor, but now his skin took on a faint glow and there was a spring in his step. Archangel Michael of Kindness and Security was certain there was a connection between the Earth visits and his friend's unprecedented happiness, so he couldn't bring himself to say no, even to such a strange request. "Promise you won't do anything stupid," Michael said. Nick smiled. "I promise." Michael grinned back. "Then your secret's safe with me. But I obviously need to taunt you mercilessly in private." "Obviously," Nick smirked. "Okay, go on through, weirdo," said Archangel Michael of Security with a wink. With a mocking salute, Nick hopped through the portal to Earth. He'd made a game of sneaking up on Eve, and he usually lost. The light was a dead giveaway, so Nick decided to hide his with shadows. He materialized behind her, leaning casually against a nearby tree, and nonchalantly said, "A few eons ago, Prenya accused Yarius of building crappy mountain ranges." Eve spun around with a small gasp, and Nick's eyes sparkled with delight. "Yarius was mortified," Nick continued, "and swore to prove her wrong by making an amazing mountain range on Earth. Millions of years pass, and he invites Prenya to see his masterpiece. She finds flaws in one mountain range after another, but Yarius keeps saying it's not the amazing one he promised. She scans the whole planet and can't find it. Finally, she goes back to Yarius and says, 'I give up. Where's this amazing mountain range?' Yarius says, 'It's at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. I thought they'd stay fish this time.' They laugh. Prenya checks it out, admits the range is amazing, and gets him an apology cake. And I swiped you a piece." Eve's eyes widened at the sight and smell of the cake. When she tasted it, her eyes managed to widen even more. "It's sweeter than fruit," she hummed appreciatively, indulging in tastes and textures beyond her imagination. Nick gazed lovingly at her. "Thank you," Eve smiled, licking the frosting from her fingers. "You're very welcome," he replied. "What did Yarius mean about the fish?" she asked. "Who stayed fish?" "Ah, evolution," Nick nodded, as his t-shirt graphic changed to a small fish being eaten by a bigger fish that's being eaten by a bigger fish. "Let's sit down. This could take a while. The short answer is, you're the fish." Eve pointed at his shirt. "Then I want to be the biggest fish." Nick laughed. "You already get the gist. Seriously, though, a long time ago, all life on Earth was aquatic, including your distant ancestors." And on the 19th visit, Nick appeared when Eve was bathing in a brook she'd come across. Her clothes were already washed and drying on a large flat boulder in the middle of the brook. Eve was just downstream of the boulder, where the water pooled waist deep for a bit before continuing on as a shallow stream again. Eve was not the least bit embarrassed for Nick to see her bathing naked. Whenever her tribe had happened upon clean water, they'd strip down and get to washing. As soon as she saw him, Eve beckoned for Nick to join her. Nick and the smiley face on his shirt blushed, but both recovered quickly. He strode towards her and slid into the shallow pool. "You got your clothes wet," Eve pointed out. "Your clothes are wet," Nick argued. Eve laughed. "My clothes were dirty." Nick slipped off his own clothes and laid them on the boulder beside hers. "You missed a spot." "Where?" Eve asked. "There," said Nick, splashing her. Eve let out a giggly squeal and splashed him back. This quickly turned into a water fight that started and ended in the pool, but also involved quite a bit of chasing each other up and down the shallower parts of the stream. Exhausted from running and laughter, Nick and Eve sprawled beside each other on the sun-warmed boulder. Nick could have simply willed the water molecules off them, but I think he enjoyed playing human, so to speak. Eve's golden skin glowed in the sunlight, and her wet, dark walnut-colored hair was splayed out over her head in wild, curly tresses. Sometime after she caught her breath, Eve asked, "What should I be doing?" "Probably gathering nuts or something," Nick replied, not opening his eyes. "On this world," she clarified. By now, Nick had shared a significant amount of confidential information with her, so she had a decent understanding of how the celestial multiverse worked. "You teach us to be good if we don't learn in life, so teach me. How do I be good now?" And just like that, humanity passed the judgment milestone. Eve asked the pivotal question hundreds or thousands of years too early, and all Earth's archangels simultaneously heard the alarm go off. Everyone knew. It was over. Nick felt like he'd had the wind knocked out of him. He sat up abruptly, clasped her hands in his, and looked deeply into her eyes. "Help each other. Try to ease suffering and increase happiness for others and yourself. And learn. Learn about everything. Welcome new ideas, but scrutinize them. And Eve, Blinding heavenly light poured onto them, and a blink later, Nick was sitting upright and handcuffed to a chair in heaven's red void, which serves as a celestial courtroom. The rest of Earth's archangels sat at a long table facing him. Nick blinked at us a few times. As soon as he realized he was wearing the shirt he'd left drying on the boulder, the emoji's smile turned into a frown. Archangel Uriel of Repentance, who oversaw the courtroom, isolated Nick's relevant memories from the last year and projected them onto a large screen for us to review. Although we're capable of spying on everything that happens, we only do it in rare, extreme circumstances like this one. Anything more would be a violation of the respect and trust we hold in one another. Nick's isolated memories showed him casually revealing secrets of science, divinity, and morality, one tempting bite of knowledge after another. It was overwhelmingly damning. Archangel Nicael, you sit accused of tampering with human development, Uriel informed him after the viewing. What do you have to say in your defense? Can you elaborate on the charges? Nick asked smallly. You pushed humanity into the Judgment Age millennia too early, shouted Archangel Zad of Admissions and Charity. You lied your way onto Earth on my watch and directly contacted a human, spat Michael, not keeping the hurt from his voice. To his credit, Nick looked ashamed for betraying his friend's trust. You are charged, Uriel answered pointedly, with 19 counts of world entry under false pretenses, 19 counts of unauthorized contact with the chosen people, 83 counts of unlawful knowledge sharing, 6 counts of egregious dishonesty, and 1 count of catastrophic disruption of a chosen people's path to salvation. How do you plead? Nick paused before quietly pleading, guilty. We all knew he was guilty, of course. Once we reviewed the footage, there was no question. But hearing his admissions still figuratively made my blood run cold. Do you have any statements of repentance to recommend leniency? Asked Archangel Uriel of Repentance. If a sinner genuinely regrets their sin and apologizes to those they wronged, including God, their penance is often reduced. Penance has 2 basic purposes: adding enough goodness to the multiverse to outweigh the sin, and training the sinner against repeating their wrongdoings. If they repent immediately, they can usually avoid the assignments that were specifically designed to guide them towards remorse. Nick considered it carefully and declared, I don't regret it. Everyone started talking at once. Raphael's voice rose above the rabble. Settle down. The room quieted, more or less. It's up to you, but I think we've heard enough, Raphael said to Uriel. All in favor of ruling that Nick is guilty? Uriel asked. There was a chorus of 6 affirmatives. Uriel banged his gavel to commemorate the verdict. Then we'll turn to God for sentencing when court adjourns. But first, let's discuss the matter of the human. Nick shot upright with horror-filled eyes and shouted, No! It wouldn't be right to punish her for this scandal, I reasoned. There were murmurs of agreement. Nick relaxed considerably, but not entirely. She's a prophet, Zad argued. Gabriel worked on her for years, but who knows what damage Nick caused. We can't let her spread our message to humanity anymore, can we? The murmurs agreed with that, too. But first and foremost, Raphael said, Nick must not communicate with her again. Nick nodded. He'd expected that. I mean ever, even after she's moved on to our plane, Raphael added. Nick had not expected that. He leapt out of the chair and lunged at Raphael, barely noticing how hard he pulled against his restraints. Shadows crept up his legs in dark tendrils. He snarled, That's outrageous! It doesn't matter what I tell her after she dies. She can know everything. Uriel pointed out, You've demonstrated that you can't control yourself around Eve, maybe around humans in general. She was under your influence for less than a year before upending humanity's bridge to salvation. Extrapolate that over eternity. The risk is too great. Speaking of which, given your history, I must recommend extreme measures to ensure you don't circumvent the terms of your punishment. I'd never seen Nick look fragile before. You can't. Not forever, no. All in favor of recommending that Nick be made incapable of perceiving Eve or information about her? Uriel asked. I'm making this a closed vote. Screens appeared in front of us, and we tapped in our answers. Michael hesitated, frozen by Nick's pleading gaze. Then he tapped his screen, and the results appeared on the big screen behind Uriel. 6 votes, unanimous. The motion is passed, Uriel declared, banging his gavel. Court adjourned. He banged his gavel again, signaling the end of the court protocol. Archangel Michael of Security and Kindness immediately teleported to Nick's side and wrapped him in an embrace that Nick didn't return. "It'll be okay, Nick. This is the best thing for you, too. Promise. And whatever happens next, I'm here for you." He said it even though he knew what would happen. We all did. Nick would be banned from the Earth Project, possibly removed from the team altogether, and would take on an undesirable role to prove himself and get back in God's good graces. Boy, were we wrong. A blue door materialized in front of Nick. He stared at it with trepidation. It was an entrance to the blue void, where he would face God and receive penance for his sin. God isn't in a particular place. They are always everywhere. They're the concept and actualization of both always and everywhere. God exists in all people, places, things, and ideas, since we are all formed from parts of them. And since time is the same as space, except viewed from a different vantage point, God literally exists in all time as well. Most people find it difficult to converse with the conscious energy of the multiverse, because there's nowhere to focus your eyes. On Earth, you look skyward, but that doesn't really work in heaven. So we designated the blue void in heaven as our primary location for conversing with the Almighty. God further helps us out by temporarily manifesting in a form that we can focus on. I've never seen them manifest in the same form twice, although Nick has. When God is particularly angry, they assume the appearance of the person being assigned penance. Nick entered the blue void with deep trepidation, which only worsened when he recognized his own eyes staring back at him. God had manifested to look exactly like Nick, without the handcuffs and sloppy attire. A long moment of silence passed. Nick asked, "Now what?" The Almighty straightened their tie. "What would you do in my place?" "Well, we gotta fix it, right?" Nick said. "So what if we tell a bunch of humans all the stuff they should have learned before the Judgment Age?" God made no indication of their opinion on the statement. Nick continued, "You know, like the purpose of life and stuff. Would it work if we just told them?" "Unfortunately, no," God said. "Fixing the mess that you caused will be a far more harrowing task. It was not your decision to make, Nick." Nick grimaced. "I know. Did I damn humanity forever?" God laughed. "Of course not, my son. There's no damnation for all time. But yes, your actions will cause great suffering for a great many of them. It will also cause great joy, ingenuity, and love." "Does that mean you're not mad at me?" Nick asked hopefully. "Nikael, I am furious with you," the Almighty corrected him. "Despite knowing this would happen, I am deeply disappointed. Your actions were selfish, juvenile, and destructive. I am also deeply proud that your intentions were noble, benevolent, and sincere." Nick didn't know how to respond, so he didn't. God continued, "Humanity will now be held accountable for the morality of their actions, although they have yet to develop the skills necessary to accurately make those judgments. Due to your recklessness, untold humans will pour into hell. It is apt that you will be there to clean up the mess." Nick was taken aback. "I'm not fired?" "Goodness, no," God replied. "You are responsible for ensuring the eventual salvation of all humanity from this point onward. It is what you signed up for as Archangel of Penance. The crucial milestone has been met, and they will all face judgment, including Eve." "Can I see her?" Nick pleaded. "I mean, after judgment." God laughed. "Now there is a thought." "I mean after she dies and passes her own personal judgment," Nick quickly clarified. "What did your siblings say?" they asked. Nick's face fell, dragging him to his knees. "It's not fair. I spent my whole life looking for my soulmate. I got less than a year with her. It's not... You wouldn't really... Please, God. Please don't do this to me. Please, God, don't take her away from me. Please." God shook their head and repeated, "What did your siblings say?" Nick's last hope lay shattered on the floor. God teleported Earth's other 6 archangels into the blue void: Michael, Uriel, Zad, Jophi, Raphael, and me. Michael immediately ran to help Nick up. "Hey, you okay?" "Don't fucking touch me!" Nick snarled, swatting him away. Michael held up his hands and backed away, as if facing a cornered animal. Earth shall persist, God announced. You shall proceed as if the humans passed the judgment milestone in the traditional way. Nick shall continue his role as Earth's archangel of penance and faith. We knew better than to interrupt, but a lot of us tried anyway. The Creator continued over us. Children, removing him from this role would not help him grow in a positive way. Furthermore, it would be unfair to task another with addressing the consequences of Nick's actions. As Archangel of Penance, he will bear the heaviest increase in workload, and his penance assignments for this debacle will be substantial, to say the least. What kind of assignments? Zad wondered. The undesirable kind, God clarified unhelpfully. The kind that are necessary as a result of his actions. Nick, because you disrupted the planned course of events, humans must now learn hard lessons quickly if they are to endure. As penance for this, you shall be responsible for teaching them these lessons. Do you understand and accept these terms? Yes, said Nick, although he would later find he was wrong to think he understood what this would cost him. After the trial, Nick stopped talking to his fellow archangels. We were scrambling to prepare for the unprecedentedly early judgment age that he thrust on us, and he didn't show up for work or answer any of our prayers or other messages. Needless to say, we were disgruntled. Archangel Raphael of Healing and Patience allowed Nick a week off before mandating his return. Only a few days passed before Michael lost patience. He knew Nick was upset and he wanted to be supportive, but Nick had betrayed and publicly humiliated him, and Michael felt well within his rights to confront him about it. Michael marched up to Nick's room in heaven and rapped on the door. There was no answer, which was strange since Nick always went to his room at times like this, so Michael knocked again. After a few minutes of knocking and waiting for absent responses, he tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. Michael stepped back and tried knocking again. He looked around. No one else was in the hallway. He reached for the doorknob as if afraid it might burn him, then briskly turned it, stepped into the room, and yanked the door shut. He called out, "Nick, you in here?" Michael was immediately concerned that it was pitch black. He unsheathed his flaming sword to give himself some light to see by. It was a good thing, too, since he narrowly avoided walking straight into a massive tree. He stepped around it and directly into a shallow pool of putrid water and muck. Wrinkling his nose in disgust, he floated upwards, surveying his surroundings. He was in a sinister-looking swamp in the middle of a moonless, starless night. Michael flew high above the tree line to scan the rest of Nick's forests. Most were partially obscured by dark clouds and heavy rains. Some had been devastated by fires. None were sunlit. Nick had many talents, but subtlety wasn't among them. All the anger Michael had brought with him seemed to float away as he observed the dismal landscape. He soared over the uncountable trees, searching for any sign that something positive remained in his friend's mindscape. After a few minutes, he thought to sheath his sword and scan for other light sources. He found one in the distance, surrounded by the darkest forests in the room. Michael approached it with caution, knowing Nick occasionally set booby traps in his own room. Deadly animals shrieked in the gloomy woods below. Michael was tempted to teleport the next few hundred meters to the bright patch, but forced himself to fly the rest of the way. At last, he reached the only sunlit spot in the room and landed gratefully on the grass. The trees were about average in height and girth. A happy little brook tumbled along, taking both ways around a large, flat boulder in the middle. It seemed familiar, but Michael couldn't remember why. Something was off about it, too. There was no wind, no movement at all aside from the brook. Suddenly, Michael realized what this place was. It was an actualized snapshot of a moment. Specifically, the moment before he dropped a heavenly beam on Nick, arresting him and escorting him to the courtroom. And it was the only place in Nick's artistic representation of his mind that wasn't shrouded in darkness. Michael teleported to the exit and left Nick's room in a hurry, closing the door behind himself, with a click that seemed to echo in the empty corridor. If he stayed any longer, he'd have to consider the implications of what he saw.